Hello, 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 mic check, hello. Khandanam Bhavabandhanam Jagabandhanam Banditam Janam Rupa Dharam Niran Janam Naram Rupa Dharam Mochana Aga Dushana Jagam Dushanam Chithana Kai Gyananjana Himalanayanam Gyananjana Himalanayanam Vikhane Mohajan Sharam Bhava Shagaram Unmadam Prema Bhatar Bhaktar Janam Yugalam Charanam Bhaktar Janam Yugalam Charanam Taranam Bhavam Jim Vedam Yugam Isharam Jagam Disharam Yoga Shahai Niram Dhanam Shamahitam Manam Niram Dhanam Shamahitam Manam Nirakhim Tava Vipam Bhanjanam Dukkam Ganjanam Karunakhanam Karma Kathar Pranar Panam Jagatam Taranam Pranar Panam Jagatam Taranam Vanchanam Kamam Kanchanam Gatim Ninditam Indriyam Rag Tagish Charam Hem Naram Varam Tagish Charam Hem Naram Varam Deha Padim Anum Rag Nirbhayam Gatam Shamshayam Driram Nischayam Manasam Van Nisham Ranam Bhagatam Sharanam Nisham Ranam Bhagatam Sharanam Tajim Jati Kula Shampadam Tavam Sripadam Bhavam Gashpadam Vari Yathai Premar Panashamam Darashana Premar Panashamam Darashana Jaga Janam Dukha Jai Sampada Tava Sripada Bhava Goshpada Variyathai Premarpana Shamadarashanam Premarpana Shamadarashanam Jaga Janam Dukha Jai Namo Namo Prabhu Bhakyamanadita Namo Namo Prabhu Bhakyamanadita Manavachanaikam Dhar Prabhu Manavachanaikam Dhar Jyotira Jyotiyo Jalaridi Kandara Jyotira Jyotiyo Jalaridi Kandara Tumitam Bhanjana Har Prabhu Tumitam Bhanjana Har Namo Namo Prabhu Bhakyamanadita Namo Namo Prabhu Bhakyamanadita Manavachanaika Dhar Prabhu Manavachanaika Dhar Jyotira Jyotiyo Jalaridi Kandara Jyotira Jyotiyo Jalaridi Kandara Tumitam Bhanjana Har Prabhu Tumitam Bhanjana Har Jai Jai Ranga Ranga Bhanga Baje Anga Shanga Mridam Jai Jai Ranga Ranga Bhanga Baje Anga Shanga Mridam गायছে ছন্দ ভক্ত বৃন্দ আরতি তোমার গাইছে ছন্দ ভক্ত বৃন্দ আরতি তোমার জয় জয় আরতি তোমার হর হর আরতি তোমার শিব শিব আরতি তোমার गुरु महाराज जी की जय। ओम ह्रीं ऋतं त्वमचलो गुणजित् गुणेभ्यः नातं दिवं सकरुणं तव पादपद्मं मोहं कषं बहुकृतं न भजे यतोऽहं तस्मात् त्वमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो भक्तिर्भगश्च भजनं भवभेदकारे गच्छन्त्यलं सुविपुलं गमनाय तत्त्वं वक्त्रोद्धृतोऽपि हृदये नामे भाति किञ्चित् तस्मात् त्वमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो तेजस्तरन्ति तरसा त्वयि तृप्त तृष्णां रागे कृते ऋतपथे त्वयि राम कृष्णे मर्त्यामृतं तव पदं मरणोर्मि नाशं तस्मात् त्वमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो कृत्यं करोति कलुषं कुहकान्तकारे श्नान्तं शिवं सुविमलं तव नाम नाथ यस्मादहं तु अशरणो जगदेक गम्य तस्मात् त्वमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो ॐ स्थापकाय च धर्मस्य सर्वधर्मस्वरूपिणे अवतार वरिष्ठाय रामकृष्णाय ते नमः। ॐ नमो श्री भगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः। ॐ नमो श्री भगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः। ॐ नमो श्री भगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः। सर्वमंगल मंगले शिवे सर्वार्थ साधिके शरण्ये त्र्यंबके गौरी नारायणी नमोस्तुते। सृष्टिं स्थितिं विनाशानां शक्ति भूते सनातने गुणाश्रये गुणमये नारायणी नमोस्तुते। शरणागतं दीनार्तं परित्राण परायणे सर्वस्यार्थे हरे देवी नारायणी नमोस्तुते। जय 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 महामाई की जय। जय भगवान श्री रामकृष्ण देव की जय। जय स्वामी जी महाराज जी की जय।
Hello, check. Hello, check. Namah Shri Atirajaya Vivekananda Sure Sachit Sukhasvarupaya Swamine Tapaharine. So we were talking about, we were discussing this lecture of Vivekananda on Maya and the evolution of the concept of God. And we had come to this stage where these somewhat dated ideas of tribal gods, who basically were inclined to be violent and creatures of passions and instincts, were found to be incongruous as human beings started thinking more and more deeply. And the ideas, I mean, as he said, these gods whose delight was in the smell of burning flesh and libations of strong liquor, could no longer be tolerated, in the sense that a sense of ethical compatibility had arisen in the minds of people, in the minds of men and women. And so just this worship of raw power, yeah, essentially this capacity to exert power over others by physical might, was no longer something that could be the sole criterion. It was understood that for our physical survival, a certain measure of strength, vitality, might, power is necessary, but in itself, just this much was regarded as inadequate for it to satisfy this urge for an ideal. Yeah? So, what then? So, the notion of might or power was tempered with the notion of mercy in certain organized religions and the notion of ethics or morality in others. It was no longer sufficient to consider just an individual god that protected its own special tribe. This led, basically, it evolved into this idea of monotheism, essentially one God, or as Vivekananda has called him here, the God of gods. This notion of a God or divinity combined in itself these two aspects, power or might, and therefore this notion of Almighty on the one hand, and on the other, somebody who was supremely ethical. So the notion of this enquiry, this process of enquiry that arose in the minds and hearts of human beings, gave rise to this notion of not just a limited God that protects its own or his or her own tribe, but rather a being which is in some sense the sum total of all beings that exist. So not confined to a specific tribe or a specific group. And so this notion of both ethics and might were combined into this notion of a God of gods. Yeah? And so from little g gods, he graduated to a single capital G God. Yeah? Now this was not a solution. I mean, it was a solution to some problems, but harder, more difficult problems arose. And this is where we were when we finished last time. And Vivekananda says, but all this patchwork, this is essentially patchwork. Because why? Because there's some kind of problems and we sort of gloss it over, provide a temporary solution and create a notion without really foresight into what are the problems that this will bring. That's how human thought progresses. But people who came up with this notion, their descendants or they themselves maybe, realize the difficulties in having this one idea of a God. But all this patchwork would not do. As the explanation assumed greater proportions, the difficulty which it sought to solve did the same. If the qualities of the God increased in arithmetical progression, the difficulty and doubt increased in geometrical progression. The difficulty of Jehovah was very little beside the difficulty of the God of the universe. And here, as an aside, he mentions a fairly candid truth. And this question remains to the present day. Essentially, this conflict between the ethics or the ethical concern on the one hand and power or might on the other is an issue that we as human beings, independent of the domain where this problem arises, whether it be a social structure, whether it be an individual in the heart, or whether it be in this notion of a God, of a supreme God of the universe. Whatever idea is, whatever framework this problem comes up in, it is not resolved. It's a problem that persists till today. And here he poses the most difficult questions that arise in the human heart and the human mind. And the question is the following: why, under the reign of an almighty and all-loving God of the universe, should diabolical things be allowed to remain? What is the root of this question? Basically, human suffering on a day-to-day basis is something very real. People suffer for various reasons. Some because of something that they wish for and do not get, in spite of all legitimate effort being put in. And chance deprives us of these results. Certain unfairness is the notion that arises in our minds and hearts. Consequence, mental suffering. Suddenly, somebody suffers from some accident or physical injury, and there's physical pain, consequently, physical suffering. And there's no clear explanation. And for those who are creatures of faith and belief, the problem becomes essentially this. This is some question that arose in the mind of Vivekananda himself. How come? I mean, when his father had passed away and he was going from place to place, hunting for a job in order to earn money to feed his family, his mother and his siblings, and he was unable to get a job for himself, this question came up. Why, under the reign of this sort of naive belief of a God who is both all-powerful and all-merciful, should there be this kind of suffering? The real response to that is, what exactly is suffering about? That question does not quite come up in the minds of people who are accepting this notion of a God who is both almighty and all merciful. How can these two coexist? How can all power and all mercy coexist with human suffering? And this question needs to be addressed at some level. But it is a question, it's a genuine question that comes up in the minds of people. And he elaborates on this question. Why so much more misery than happiness, and so much more wickedness than good? And then he talks of the usual reaction. We may shut our eyes to all these things, but the fact still remains that this world is a hideous world. At best, it is the hell of Tantalus. Here we are with strong impulses and stronger cravings for sense enjoyments, but cannot satisfy them. There rises a wave which impels us forward in spite of our own will, and as soon as we move one step, comes a blow. We are all doomed to live here like Tantalus. Ideals come into our head far beyond the limit of our sense ideals, but when we seek to express them, we cannot do so. On the other hand, we are crushed by the surging mass around us. This is the practical problem. An ideal seeks to express itself. As soon as we try, it is crushed by one, our physical limitations, two, societies in which we live, and so on. But does it mean we give up this component of ideality? And he answers that. Yet, if I give up all ideality and merely struggle through this world, my existence is that of a brute. And I degenerate and degrade myself. So neither provides a solution. Neither way is happiness. Unhappiness is the fate of those who are content to live in this world, born as they are. 1,000 times greater misery is the fate of those who dare to stand forth for truth and for higher things, and who dare to ask for something higher than mere brute existence here. These are facts, but there is no explanation. There cannot be any explanation. This is, in one short paragraph, the problem that arises. And as he says, there is no explanation, there cannot be any explanation. We can adjoin words to pretend to explain away this conflict in our existence. So some religions posit a devil in charge, or a Satan in charge of all the bad that there is, all the evil that there is, and the God is supposed to be good. Yes, it does address the issue of an ethical God on the one hand, but if that God be all powerful, then how come he or she does not manage to subdue this devil? This is basically the problem with any dualistic religion. These questions are completely unanswerable or even ununderstandable in the context of any dualistic framework. Basically, it says that look, this power, this notion of all powerfulness that you impute to a personal God is just not compatible with this notion of mercy or ethical or an ethical God. The other way in Indian religions has been to replace the notion of a devil by the notion of karma. But that doesn't solve the problem, it just changes the word. A devil responsible for all evil is replaced by this abstract notion of karma or work. Well, if the personal God be all powerful, then he or she should be able to take care of all karma. How come karma is responsible for bad and the God is responsible for all good? There have been two solutions to this. Purva Mimamsa, one of the schools of Indian philosophy, lays greater stress on karma or work, whereas Uttar Mimamsa or Vedanta posits that the solution lies in consciousness and consciousness alone, which is free of this duality of good and bad. And really the question, and this is what he'll address here, the Vedanta shows the way out. You must bear in mind that I have to tell you facts that will frighten you sometimes, but if you remember what I say, think of it and digest it, it will be yours, it will raise you higher and make you capable of understanding and living in truth. The solution does not come by trying to put this notion of all powerfulness and all mercifulness or all goodness or all ethics in a personal God together and keeping that God as somebody separate out there. Really, this inquiry needs to go back to the place where these questions come up from. The questions are not there outside. The questions come up in the human mind. And it is there that the solution needs to be sought. And the answer to this question, basically posing the question in this way, what is the solution to this problem? How come in the regime of an all-merciful God does there exist all this hideousness, all this evil, all the misery that human beings suffer? How can this misery, that is an existential fact, be commensurable, be compatible with the notion of a merciful God, who is also supposed to be all-powerful? It violates our basic sense of propriety. These seem totally incompatible. What then? Where is it Where is the solution? And he elaborates on this problem a little further. Now, it is a statement of fact that this world is as tantalus as hell, that we do not know anything about this universe, yet at the same time we cannot say that we do not know. I cannot say that this chain exists when I think that I do not know it. It may be an entire delusion of my brain. I may be dreaming all the time. I am dreaming that I am talking to you and that you are listening to me. No one can prove that it is not a dream. My brain itself may be a dream, and as to that, no one has ever seen his own brain. We all take it for granted. So it is with everything. My own body, I take for granted. This is sort of the ignorance that we have on the one hand. At the same time, I cannot say I do not know. Because it is only based on this assumption that I do know that this world exists around me that I interact with it. So there is a problem in admitting or in trying to claim that I do know what's going on around me on the one hand. At the same time, there is a problem by claiming that I am in complete ignorance, which means that our existence is our individual existence. Forget this notion of a personal God for the time being. We'll come back to it. But basically looking at our own existence, which is the raw data from which these concepts, these ideas evolve. On the one hand, there is this notion of a good, there is the notion of a bad, which is what gives rise to these notions of ethics, these ethical concerns. Similarly, in the domain of knowledge, in the domain of epistemology, there is this coexistence of knowledge and ignorance. These are extremes. Our minds are conditioned. It's a definition of the human condition that it thinks in terms of these dual pairs of opposites. In terms of our feeling and ethics, we think of a good versus a bad, opposites. In terms of our brain and intellect, we think of knowledge versus ignorance. There are these antipodes which define our day-to-day existence. And this domain where things are confused, things are conflated with each other, is where we make our stand as human beings. Our intellect seeks clarity but does not get it. Our hearts and feelings seek all joy or all perfect ethical standards. We don't get it. And we cannot exercise such notions of ethics in practice, nor notions of complete knowledge in practice. Our lives are defined by these contradictions, these poles, these antipodal pairs of opposites. And they define our day-to-day existence. We can give that a word, a label. And that label in Vedanta is called Maya. It doesn't form an explanation. It does not claim to provide an explanation. It basically tells you what is, not why it is. Because the answer to that why really leads to an enquiry into ourselves, into our own natures. Not an inquiry into an external objective God, somebody who we look upon as somebody outside, who is very powerful and is capable of relieving us of our misery, of the misery of various people. The enquiry then really boils down to an enquiry into our own natures, an enquiry into these opposite pairs of love and hate, of joy and woe, of knowledge and ignorance, which define our day-to-day existence in this world. And the question becomes, instead of asking, why is the world like this? The question really ought to be, why is it that I see the world this way? This is the beginning of the self-enquiry. The standing between knowledge and ignorance, this mystic twilight, the mingling of truth and falsehood, and where they meet, no one knows. This is poetry, but it is basically expressing this anguish of the human heart, unable to fathom this fundamental dichotomy and the resulting confusion that defines our day-to-day lives. We are walking in the midst of a dream, half sleeping, half waking, passing all our lives in a haze. This is the fate of every one of us. In other words, when we try to understand these fundamental aspects of our being, not in terms of any external hypothesis, the enquiry not into this objective personal God now, almighty, all-powerful, but now an enquiry into our own day-to-day existential condition, we are faced with this confusion, this lack of clarity. What is it in us that makes us move between these two poles? This is the fate of all sense knowledge. This is the fate of all philosophy, of all boasted science, of all boasted human knowledge. This is the universe. In other words, what he is saying here is that however much we try to conceptualize things away, the problem does not vanish. The problem becomes more clearly defined, perhaps, at least in our own mind. We understand more clearly where the conflict lies, where the conflict between power on the one hand and ethics on the other lies, where the conflict between this aspiration for an ideal and the limitations of our senses and our incapacity to express it in the world lies. We can identify this contradiction and see it more clearly. We'll come back to this next class, but really the whole aim and end of this initial part, almost half the lecture, so to speak, of Vivekananda, is to clearly put before us these contradictions that define our day-to-day existence. The moment we call something good, it automatically brings in its train the notion of a bad. Why? Because it brings with it the sense of judgment. And anything that is a sense of judgment brings these antipodal pairs along with it. What will we gain by this understanding? By this greater clarity in terms of what the problem is? Well, if the problem becomes clearer, what does it mean for the problem to become clearer? It basically means that we have somehow moved our being a little further back. We are not trying to sense these problems with as much attachment as we were prior to this, but we are able to see it objectively as something that is spread out before us in terms of something that is outside of us. Basically, this means an acceptance of the universe as is, not the way we would like it to be. There is a story from the Buddha's life. There was a lady who had lost her son. And the Buddha was there at the village. And this lady came along and basically, clearly there was this deep misery, sorrow, pathos. And asked basically the Buddha to bring this dead person back to life. His response was simple: yes, one can do that. All that you need to do is to go and get a handful of mustard seeds from a house where there has been no death, where there has been no misery. This was a parable. The woman went from house to house and came back and understood this existential fact that she is not alone in this human condition which suffers loss, which suffers grief. It does not mean that we become callous. It does not mean that we refuse to express sympathy or empathy. But understanding that this is what defines our human condition, it forces us to acknowledge that we are in this same boat. And just as another person is facing human mortality today, we in our turn need to accept this as part and parcel of our lives. In fact, it teaches us to grow in empathy, grow in compassion. And it is this growth that finally culminates in accepting the world with all its contradictions as aspects of ourselves. And this is really the end towards which Vedanta is headed. The good and the bad, towards whom we are inclined to make judgments, that tendency of the mind starts decreasing. It doesn't mean that we will not do what we think is right. We will. But it will sap the fanaticism out of it. It will basically train us to see that there is no absolute good, there is no absolute bad in this world. This good and bad, this knowledge and ignorance, this joy and woe, which defines our existence, is part and parcel of everybody's life. And it will train us to share in that. It will expand. Basically, our consciousness of what comprises one's existence, that notion starts expanding because we start sharing in these experiences and realize that, look, this is not something that is confined to me and me alone in this little organism, this biophysical and psychophysical organism, which I, by a purely ad hoc convention, call me and my life. This is something much more general, much larger, and then we shall be able to participate in this larger life in the midst of which we are somehow there. Makes our lives more conscious and inclined towards greater empathy, a much deeper notion than compassion. If there is anything that one can call an unmitigated bad, it is utter lack of empathy and a refusal to acknowledge that other people are entitled to the same rights, to the same feelings, to the same uh, liberties that one is oneself. It's therefore that the solution to this conundrum of a personal God who is both almighty and all ethical then goes back to a hunt in the individual and a process of enquiry into oneself as to why one thinks of power and compassion or sympathy as two aspects of one's life, and forces one to move back to accept what we call good and bad today as part and parcel of not just my life, but everybody's life. In the process, our minds develop greater clarity and greater compassion. We'll come back to this. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om Tat Sat. Shri Ramakrishna Namastu.